Apple TV's Foundation is an epic sci-fi story spanning several centuries based off the 1951 trilogy by Isaac Asimov. The premise is somewhat simple. A brilliant mathematician by the name of Hari Seldon has created a mathematical equation that can predict the future, and this future does not look good. According to Hari, if humanity fails to make drastic changes, it will endure 30,000 years of war and destruction. This doesn't sit well with the current ruler of the Empire, who believes Hari's claims to be treasonous and an affront to his power. This is Brother Day, also known as the Emperor. He's a member of what is known as the Genetic Dynasty, a long line of clones that have held on to power for over 400 years. When one of them gets old, they pass power on to a younger copy, so at any one time there are at least 3 emperors of varying ages: Brother Dawn, Brother Day, and Brother Dusk. Absolute power is consolidated through Brother Day. They're based off of the first emperor, known as Cleon I, and this ensures the empire is ruled by a constant and consistent hand. But this also has its downsides. At the end of episode 1, a group of insurgents blow up the Starbridge, a massive tower that transports people from space to the planet Trantor's surface. Planet Trantor is the Empire's home planet. This attack causes 100 million deaths and only emboldens the Emperor to take action against Hari, who sees the attack as the first of many catastrophes to befall humanity in the upcoming Age of Darkness. But Brother Day is smart. Instead of executing Hari, he decides to exile him to a planet on the outer reaches known as Terminus. His intention is to let him continue his work, and should Hari's predictions come true, use it to further increase his power. What greater weapon for an emperor than a formula that can predict the future? This mathematical equation is part of what is called psychohistory.
Psychohistory is a predictive model designed to forecast the behavior of very large populations.
So Hari is tasked with starting a colony on Terminus and establishing what is known as the Foundation. The thinking here is that when civilization crumbles, as he has predicted, humanity will need something to build on. Rather than start from nothing, they'll have a foundation, a giant encyclopedia of sorts containing all of humanity's greatest achievements and technologies. He says that with a successful foundation, this Age of Darkness can be reduced from 30,000 years to 1,000. For the Emperor, exiling Hari is a win-win. If it turns out Hari's predictions are rubbish, he's already exiled. If it turns out they're true, he can use it to further bolster his own power. In episode 2, while en route to Terminus, Hari Seldon is killed by his adopted son, Raish. But unbeknownst to the crew, this is all an elaborate plan for something far greater, a plan that will see the overthrow of the Empire and the end of its tyrannical rule. This leads us to the events of the season's final episode, which starts with Hari's casket being shot out into space. Prior to his death, a death orchestrated by Hari himself, he took a pill containing millions of self-replicating molecular machines. These machines broke his body down and became one with his casket, creating what is known as the Vault. The Vault landed on Terminus before the settlement arrived, and no one could really examine it because of a self-defense feature known as the Null Field. It's an invisible force which, when one would get close to it, would make them pass out. There was one person, however, who was impervious to this field. That's Salvor Hardin, the Warden of Terminus, but we'll get to her in a bit. As we begin the final episode, 2 rival factions have arrived on Terminus, bringing their centuries-long hatred of one another to the planet. These are the Anacreons and Thesmans, and it looks as though all-out war is imminent if it weren't for the arrival of Hari Seldon emerging from the Vault. It's not the real Hari Seldon, more so a manifestation of his consciousness. And this was all part of his plan, to create a new civilization not ruled by one voice like the Empire, but of many. He goes on to say,
"But the Foundation was never about curating knowledge. It was about curating people."
But how does he hope to manage this with these 2 factions who absolutely hate each other? Throughout the course of the season, the show has stressed the importance of history, how whoever writes it can turn a villain into a hero and a liar into a truth teller. This is what happened centuries ago with Cleon II, the first of the Genetic Dynasty clones. He had these 2 upstart kingdoms, the Anacreons and Thesmans, who were only getting more powerful by joining their 2 kingdoms through marriage, so he orchestrated a murder involving the royals to make it look like one of the kingdoms backstabbed the other, and voila, he rewrote history in his favor.
Why fight 2 upstart kingdoms when you can exploit their racial animus and have them fight each other?
Harry believes that if they all join together, they can bring about the downfall of the Empire and create a new civilization that will withstand the dark times to come. They even have their hands on the Invictus, the Empire's largest weapon, which went missing 700 years ago and was deemed lost for good. But this is just a starting point. Back on Trantor, Brother Day decides the fate of Brother Dawn, who we found out was unwillingly involved in a plot to overthrow the Empire. Over the course of the season, Brother Dawn fell in love with one of his servants, a gardener by the name of Azura. He confided in her that he's not like his brothers. He's colorblind and left-handed, but how could this be? He's supposed to be an exact copy. This doubt led him to escape, fearing if his brothers found out about his differences, they would kill him. So he seeks refuge with Azura, only to be betrayed by her. She's part of a resistance, the one responsible for genetically modifying his DNA, meaning someone on the inside must have had access to the genetic tanks in which their bodies are made.
It's been confirmed. The lifeboats have been disabled. No one survived. I am so sorry, Lady Denizen.
A moment of silence. Silence, please.
I'll always be here, as I always have been.
How often does it end like this? How often do we choose this?
You always do.
Is anyone truly free? And how would you know when you weren't? Can you believe what you see? And how would you know if you couldn't? Demerzel is a character who understands the specific limitations that prevent her freedom. And from its introduction, Ignis was a place where you knew you couldn't trust anything you saw. Way back in episode 6, there was what seemed like a quick turn by Gale, where she went from an impasse on the beggar with Tellum to telling Harry that the Mentalics would only follow one of their own and that he should let her take the lead. There was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time. The distortion on the screen and the ruse that followed that made Salvor think Harry left on their ship. But this quick change of heart by Gale felt more like the show was withholding information, which made it stand out. Then in episode 8, there is a moment where Tellum wants to put everything else aside and get honest for a minute. She knows that Gale knew that Harry was dead since the moment it happened, and wants her to confirm that she felt him drowning. Obviously, Tellum doesn't care about Harry or how his death affected Gale. She's just interested in her body and her power. So when Gale responds that she felt the water filling her lungs and that she felt everything, Tellum is way too interested in the idea that she could access suffering over a distance and that she could hide the truth to realize that she never says that she felt him die. Withholding this detail turns out to be very important because, as we learned at the end of the last episode, he didn't. And that sets the stage for a host of twists and reveals to close out Foundation's second season. The season 2 finale opens by showing us that Gale did indeed feel Harry drowning, but was able to use her mentalic powers to save him. On the spectrum of reveals that relied on us not having the necessary information to sort things out, I would say this one hits just about right. It never really made sense that they would put Harry in a new body just to kill him off. There are several clues like the ones I just mentioned that you can go back and pick up on, and unlike when Salvor had her mind switched off in the water at the end of episode 7, they did enough with Harry's flashback to make you think this might be his ending. To save him and to conceal that fact from a planet of people who can look inside your mind, Gale had to use everything that she picked up from Tellum in their confrontation on the beggar. She had to give the Mentalic left to guard Harry a need to help him. They had to take advantage of that, they had to kill him, and then smother his attempts to reach out with his unvoice, while after the fact they had to create an illusion to make him look like Harry. Then they had to get the real Harry back through tens of kilometers worth of dense terrain, which required that they build a bridge of shared sensations, knowing all the while that any slip could draw the Mentalic's attention. This explains why Gale was acting so strangely towards Salvor in episode 207. They are able to pull all this off, Harry shows up at the last minute to end Tellum and save Gale and Salvor. Once that happens, the Mentalics show up and Josiah tries to assure them that now that she's gone, they don't need to fear them. They explain that she was bending them to her will, and now for the first time since they arrived on Ignis, they feel free. It takes some convincing, but in the end, they come around and open the door, and almost like it's a reflex, the Mentalics bow down to their liberators, which brings to mind Harry's quip about people liking to kneel. After that, things appear to be pretty good. Developing a second foundation was a crucial part of Harry's plan, and the Mentalics should have the skills necessary to become that. Salvor looks happy, she's smiling and she's bonding with the kids. You could see a future for her there amongst these people where she would finally fit in. This piece is short-lived because we find out Tellum managed to jump into Josiah's body as she was dying. She takes control and grabs a gun and tries to shoot Gale. Salvor sees what's happening and jumps in the middle, throwing Rachel's knife to stop him, but she also gets shot and starts to bleed out in the process. With the life draining out of Josiah's body, he says he can feel Tellum getting weaker and dying with him. This feels like a definitive ending for Tellum, but I suppose you never know with a character with those kinds of powers. Salvor's situation is even less ambiguous. Gale and Harry rush to her side, but her condition deteriorates quickly. And while this is shocking and sad, Salvor herself sees this as good news because now they know they can change the future. With her final words, she says, Mom, don't you see what this means? It means we're not trapped. You were right, the future can be changed. You can still get it back on the right course. I have absolute faith in... And she dies before she finishes that sentence. Absolute faith in Gale, Harry, psychohistory, or all of the above. It doesn't really matter because she dies with a sense that she's made a contribution to the future through her sacrifice. They burn her body on a funeral pyre to give her a proper send-off, and while Josiah and Salvor are the first characters I've mentioned who don't survive the finale, they're definitely not the last. And speaking of sacrifice, there is plenty of that to go around on the Destiny. Terminus has been reduced to a cracked globe floating in space, and Brother Day is right where we left him, basking in the glow of his incredible display of power. There isn't much anyone else can do but look on in horror, which only increases when they find out this is just the beginning. After making Brother Constant list the names of the other planets that have joined the Foundation's cause, Brother Day issues the command to jump to Thespis to destroy that next. This choice introduces some additional cruelty given that Constant's family has roots there, but this is one of those situations where you don't exactly want to give him credit for choices he's made because he just destroyed a planet, but from his perspective, trying to eradicate what he describes as a cancer waiting to metastasize makes a sort of sense. At the end of episode 9, I thought, well, they have had over 100 years to prepare. And even if this is the plan going all the way wrong, there must have been a non-zero chance of this happening, which means that they would have factored it in. They've been spreading out all this time, so who knows, maybe the people on the planet will be a sacrifice, and their martyrdom will inspire generations of future Foundationers. We'll talk about how the reality is more complicated than that in a bit, but Brother Day doesn't have any additional information to work with here. So strategically, you can see why he makes this choice. And then let's not forget that this is exactly who Empire is. Demerzel left him behind when she went to Trantor to deal with more pressing matters because she knows this. Her absence reminds us of the scene in the second episode of the series, where she talks to a young Cleon the 13th after his predecessor committed an atrocity against Anacreon and Thespis. The child asks her how often does it end like this? How often do we choose this? And she answers matter-of-factly that they always do. Regardless, this is a line too far, and Belrios finally refuses his order after he realizes that there's no talking Day out of it. This earns him a slap and some taunting before Day turns to Sheben's light and threatens to kill everyone on board if she doesn't make the jump. She agrees, but instead initiates a jump sequence that results in the ships jumping into the space occupied by the next closest ship and starting a chain reaction that will destroy the entire fleet. This came about through a secret deal that Hober struck with the Spacers, who concealed the sequence in that mark on his wrist. Again, this information was withheld from the audience. And it did seem odd at the time Shia's center was so quick to turn down the offer, and now we know that she didn't. This isn't an easy choice to make. As Day points out, this is a suicide. Every one of those ships has a spacer on it that will have to give their life so that their kind can be free. She-Ben's light tells him it's a small price to pay for that freedom, and this recontextualizes her brief meeting with her mother when they met to turn over Hober. While no one on board can be happy about the situation they're in, I imagine they all enjoyed watching as Hober explains how this was their plan from the beginning, and that Day walked right into it because he's so predictable. He adds that Bell half figured it out, but twists the knife a little bit more by adding that Day never listens to him. If you're keeping track, this is the third destruction of Cleon the 17th's self-image in quick succession, and he decides that this will be the last. Once he finds out he can't escape, he starts beating the hell out of Hober. Bell jumps in and does a little better, but also gets a pretty serious thrashing. And if you could say one good thing about this Cleon, it would be that he has a jaw on him. He manages to throw Bell into the airlock and spaces him, but at the last minute, Bell activates the castling device so that Day turns out to be the one hurling to a quick end in the vacuum of space. The setup makes for a satisfying end. You knew the castling device would play a part as soon as Hober explained how it worked on Corel, and you get this great shot of the body floating in front of the backdrop of the destroyed terminus. And the fact that the castling device switches their clothes means that the Imperial corpse looks like it's wearing shorts as it drifts away. While this is a victory of sorts, everyone on the ship is still going to die. Well, almost everyone. Bell explains that even though the ship's escape pods are locked down, that there is an external cleaning module that has room for one person and a day's worth of breathable air. Hober and
If you could describe the season finale of Game of Thrones in one word, how would you describe it?
Disappointing.
So Game of Thrones just ended, and if we're being honest, it kind of sucked. Despite what you may think by looking at the title of this video, I actually used to like this show. I read the first book back in middle school, which I definitely should not have been allowed to do. Then I started the fourth book before I realized that I was making a mistake. The books didn't really have numbers on them back then, and I got confused, alright? But the point is that was a long time ago, and I never could have anticipated back then that these nerdy-ass books would spawn the most popular show ever. I mean, it's so popular that Elmo even watches it.
Elmo thinks that you two need to respect each other.
The fuck you say to me, you little shit!
I think this show is definitely a step above other shows of its type. I mean, think about it. How many fantasy shows even come close to the quality of Game of Thrones? But the problem is, this show really dropped the ball. Like, it really screwed up.
Have you shot your final scenes yet? And are you happy with how things ended? Yes. She didn't say yes. You didn't say yes.
Best season ever!
It's the best. It's the best season ever.
This show fell victim to something I always warn about. Bad writing. I talk about bad writing in like every video I've ever made. And now that we've all seen the finale of this show, I hope you realize why writing is important. Because this show has pretty good acting, some pretty good cinematography, incredibly impressive effects, moments of really fun editing, and yet everybody is mad because the writing is bad. And honestly, that's the only thing wrong with this show. But it's so bad that it really makes it hard to appreciate the rest of the stuff. You know how many movies or shows are saved by having good writing? Hell, it's the only reason Woody Allen still has a career. If you watch Game of Thrones all the way through from beginning to end, it feels like everything that was important at first just kind of gets thrown away. The show just morphs into something bizarre. The themes and ideas that were once important are now completely gone and replaced with more generic fantasy tropes. Something just don't feel right anymore, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. So, let's take a look at why. Oh, and by the way, if it wasn't obvious,
You're spoiling it! You're spoiling everything!
Now, if you're a weirdo who's never watched Game of Thrones because you don't mind missing out on cultural media milestones, I'll explain the general premise for you. The story revolves around a bunch of families in the land of Westeros. Westeros is a fantasy land with dragons and magic, but dragons and magic are pretty rare. The aforementioned families are all fighting one another because shit happens and the king dies, and it's a series about political intrigue, realistic complex characters, and boobs. However, most of these concepts kind of get fucked up by the end of the series. It kind of stops being a show about characters and politics. Characters used to get by on their wit and creativity, but now it's just fighting. Remember how I said magic and dragons were pretty rare? Well, not anymore. When the writers don't know what to do, we either get magic, a dragon, or a fight. And sometimes we get all three at once. And that's because the writers are not very good at writing this show. And yes, I know that sounds a little weird, so I'm gonna explain. The Song of Ice and Fire series is written by George R.R. Martin, and a good 80% of the show is adapted from these books, and about 75% of that is actually really good. Now, the show itself is written by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, or as a lot of people like to call them, D&D. Now, for what it's worth, they are pretty good at adapting this material for the screen. They have a good way of cutting the unnecessary stuff, accentuating the important elements that might not be immediately important, and presenting it in a fresh and engaging way. Now, a lot of people shit on these guys because of the recent seasons, but let's not forget that the good stuff is partly their work too. So if these guys are pretty good at adapting existing material, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that around season 4 and 5, they ran out of books. See, unfortunately for them, the books aren't finished, and when they signed on to do the show, they probably thought the series would be over by then. But then we all found out the hard way that George R.R. Martin is kind of lazy. I mean, it's kind of hard to say that because you can't really get a read on the guy. The first 3 books have a mere 2 years between each of them, and that's about normal. That's a pretty quick pace. Then there are 5 years between books 3 and 4, then 6 years between books 4 and 5, and book 5 came out 8 years ago with no release on book 6 in sight. And there's still supposed to be a book after that one. Now, my personal theory has always remained that George kinda knew he wasn't gonna be able to finish the books in time for the show, so he just decided to wait for the show to finish. Which is honestly the better marketing choice, even though I don't know if he really cares about that. I mean, think about it. What if the show was in like season 6, way after they're done adapting the books directly? Then he releases a book with completely different stuff in it. Who the fuck is gonna read it now when the show's still on? It would just be confusing to consume 2 stories named the same thing, but with different shit happening. I think he knows that the show is like the most popular thing ever, and if he releases the book, it's just unnecessary competition. It's better to just do the books after the hype of the show has died down a bit. But either way, the point is that D&D ran out of books. They had a few tidbits from George, but that's about it. But outside of those few elements, the show just had to start making shit up. And these guys aren't really good at that. Once they started writing original content, we got some of the worst plot lines in Game of Thrones history. We also got some of the worst dialogue.
You want a good girl, but you need a bad pussy.
Not to mention
The conclusion of Invasion Season 2 leaves viewers with more questions than answers regarding the intentions and inner workings of the main alien race. Invasion Season 2 concludes with a walkthrough of all the arrangements Mitsuki makes to maintain control over the alien gateway and allow Trevant to intervene. Luke utilizes his mind control skills to prevent the aliens from assaulting anyone in the interim. To his astonishment, he connects with the other psychic kids as well, and they assist him in defending his family. In contrast, Caspar uses the map he and his newfound psychic bud is made to attempt another journey into the alien psyche in the hopes of discovering additional information. As the episode comes to a close, Mitsuki collapses to the ground and Trevant enters the alien gateway. Trevant meets Caspar on the opposite side prior to the credits rolling. But in the last scene of Invasion Season 2, there's something strange about Caspar that suggests there's more to his intentions and personality than meets the eye. What's wrong with Caspar at the end of Invasion Season 2? In the last scene of Invasion, Trevant bravely passes through Mitsuki's constructed alien portal, while Caspar enters the alien psyche. Trevant's unexpected discovery of Caspar in the alien labyrinth on the other side of the alien portal is similar to an earlier Invasion Season 2 scenario, where Mitsuki encounters Caspar in the same area. But there appears to be something different about Caspar this time. Before the credits begin to roll, his eyes change to an enigmatic shade of blue, suggesting that he might not be in control, even though he greets Trevante at first and says he can help him through the alien labyrinth. Invasion Season 2 makes it clear that characters like Mitsuki, Luke, and Caspar have linked to the alien hive mind in some way during the course of the episode. They try their hardest, but they can't always use this power to gain influence over the aliens. On occasion, they are even able to regulate the size of the aliens' portals and prevent them from assaulting people. Sometimes, though, it seems as though the approaching extraterrestrial powers take control of them and reduce them to puppets. Caspar appears to have been taken over by the alien hive mind near the conclusion of Invasion Season 2. This might imply that, rather than guiding Trevant in the proper direction, he will mislead him, especially now that he is aware that he is in
Well, colour me mildly surprised. Normally when a popular show starts to noticeably decline in quality, it marks the beginning of an irreversible death spiral that inevitably leads to cancellation or the whole thing vanishing into irrelevancy. Just ask Westworld, or Game of Thrones. And so it seemed to be with Stranger Things, one of the most interesting new shows on Netflix when it first came out way back in 2016. When it first started, it was a compelling mystery with neat little touches of horror and dark fairy tale tragedy, and just the right amount of 1980s nostalgia that you almost felt you were watching some weird mashup of The Goonies, Halloween, and E.T. Unfortunately, Season 2 was basically just an unimaginative retread of previous ground, minus the compelling mystery and sympathetic characters. Season 3 on the other hand was marked by cast bloat, power creep, nostalgia burnout, and an unwelcome swerve towards goofy physical comedy, to the point where I even made a very pissy video complaining about how shit Stranger Things had become. It really felt like a show that had outlived its own premise, either making unsuccessful trips down creative dead ends, or falling back on the same tired tropes that were played out 2 seasons earlier, and I'd be lying if I said I had much enthusiasm for the long-delayed Season 4. But holy shit, imagine my shock when I found myself once again pulled into a compelling storyline that teased whole new mysteries, rooting for a cast of characters that felt fresh and likeable and sympathetic again, and happily letting Netflix auto-load the next episode, eager to see what would happen next. If I didn't know better, I'd say that Stranger Things somehow got good again. But how the fuck did such a thing come to be? Well, grab your Walkman and join the drinker as we investigate together. The story kicks off about a year after the events of the previous season, where the main cast have all gone their different ways, resulting in multiple different storylines that are running concurrently but taking place in different parts of the worlds. The first plotline focuses on Eleven, who's struggling to make a new life for herself out in California with Joyce, Will, and Jonathan. Her classmates don't take very well to her, and because she's socially naive and doesn't have her powers to magically fix any problem that comes her way, she's kind of vulnerable to their bullying. A visit from Mike leads to a disastrous confrontation at a roller disco and a falling out between the two of them. Meanwhile, to nobody's surprise, Hopper is alive but not exactly well in a Siberian prison camp. How exactly did he survive being at ground zero for an exploding particle accelerator? Well, he just kind of ducked, okay? Don't question it. The point is, he knows that his days in the Soviet Union are numbered unless he can break out, so he hatches a daring plan to contact Joyce back in America and get some help springing him from jail. Both of these things are basically sideshows to the main storyline, which takes place back in Hawkins, where the remaining characters get caught up in a series of gruesome murders, where the victims float up into the air and then get crunched up worse than a fucking UPS delivery. Clearly something supernatural is at work here, and as more people turn up dead, it's up to the gang to discover what's really going on and put a stop to it before the whole town gets destroyed. And their mission becomes even more urgent when one of their own gets targeted by the mysterious force that's hunting them. Like I say, there's a lot going on this season, and it's not until the epic final episode that the various plot lines all come together to resolve the main narrative. But what's impressive is that all three of these major plot threads are interesting and entertaining in their own rights. Unlike previous seasons, you never feel like you have to suffer through one tedious storyline to get to something more interesting, and everything moves along at a fast enough pace that you always feel like you're getting something out of it. Splitting the main characters up into different groups was a pretty good way of tackling one of my big criticisms of season 3, which was cast bloat. Every season had added new characters, and since very few of them ever died or left the story permanently, the obvious result was that there were far too many people and not enough things for them to do. Case in point, Lucas, who always felt like the odd man out of the group, just kind of hanging around in the background with no clear role and no particular character arc. But now he's become a conflicted teenager torn between two different social groups, and his attempt to rebuild his relationship with Max now forms the backbone of a pretty satisfying arc for him. On that subject, the writers pulled off the seemingly impossible with this one and actually made me care about Max this season. I'd said in my previous video that she was probably one of the worst additions to this show, just a generic snarky girl that's moody and angry most of the time, drives a wedge between Elle and Mike for no particular reason, and generally acts like an arrogant bitch towards everyone, but somehow gets accepted into the group like an annoying ginger messiah. Even her abusive relationship with her brother couldn't make me warm to her. And yet here I was, rooting for her to pull through, gripped by a tense scene where she had to escape the antagonist, and generally liking and empathising with her in a way that I never had before. I don't know if the extra years have given the actress a bit more maturity and nuance, or if the writers were smart enough to realise that what they were doing just wasn't working, but either way, they absolutely nailed it this time around. Another big problem in season 3 was Eleven. Not only was she degenerating into a generic bratty teenager and losing the unique aspects of her character that made her so interesting, but she'd become overpowered to the point where she was fucking crippling the story. She was basically able to use her powers for almost anything with no cost to herself, and it practically became a meme that every single confrontation got resolved by her screaming in slow motion while suffering a nosebleeds. Now she's completely lost without her powers, and her main arc this season is her struggle to regain them while also delving deeper into her own past. I mean, yeah, the show is clearly retconning some of her personal history, but not to the point where it breaks her character completely. Basically what I'm saying here is that the writers managed to rediscover that compelling combination of vulnerability, childlike innocence, and dangerous unpredictability that made Eleven so fucking awesome in season 1. I mean, if I had to be super picky, then I'd say that Mike, Will, and Jonathan are basically stuck in a holding pattern for a good chunk of the season until the plot decides it's time for them to step up and do something again. It's not a major issue because there's enough other things going on that you can kind of put them into the back of your mind, but it does leave them feeling a bit surplus to requirements this time around. And as for the new additions, Argyle is decent enough as a stoner working as a pizza delivery guy. He's basically there for comic relief and he's fine in small doses, but I'm glad that the writers didn't try to give him too much screen time. On the other hand, my Man of the Match award has got to go to Eddie, the leader of a fantasy roleplay group who witnesses 2 of the murders and basically gets framed for the whole thing. He's charismatic and dominant when he's in his element, but when the shit hits the fan, the bravado quickly vanishes and it becomes obvious that he's absolutely not a hero. But just like Hudson from Aliens, he comes good in the end and delivers one of the most memorable performances the show's ever seen. I also have to give big props to the tonal shift this season. One of my big gripes about season 3 was the gradual descent into goofy comedy that completely destroyed the tension and drama that once made the show so gripping. But thank fuck, season 4 puts that right. Big time. The antagonist is a Freddy Krueger type character that gets inside your head, preying on all your subconscious fears and guilts and weaknesses before finally killing you in extremely gory fashion. It's dark and violent and brutal, and the show doesn't shy away from any of it. Yeah, the mystery about who the antagonist really is and where he comes from will be pretty obvious to anyone that's been paying attention, and it does try to pull a Blofeld from Spectre by suggesting that he was the guy secretly responsible for everything that's happened up to this point. But for the most part, I think he's actually actually well handled. He's definitely way more interesting than the fucking Mind Flayer, that's for sure. Overall, it really feels like the Duffer Brothers watched my video bitching about Season 3 and basically decided to work through it point by point, correcting each and every bone of contention along the way. I mean, I'm sure none of that's actually true, and they don't even know who the hell I am, but I don't really care. Credit where credit's due, they correctly understood the problems and they set out to fix them, and that alone deserves praise these days considering how many arrogant arseholes are out there steadfastly refusing to take the L in the face of all logic and reason. It's a pretty rare showrunner that has the wisdom to recognise they've fucked up, the humility to acknowledge it, and the brains to actually put it right. But somehow the Duffer Brothers have demonstrated all three. They took an aging show with a worn out premise that I practically lost interest in and remade it into a genuinely compelling experience again. And personally, I'm excited to see how they round things out with the 5th and final season. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.